You shouldn't be out in this. Let me help you inside.
I have nowhere to go.
We'll find a way.
In the upper echelons of London high society, a tale is told about a multi-billion-dollar empire that was saved by a single cup of tea. It sounds impossible, doesn't it? But if you believe that one act of pure, irrational kindness can rewrite destiny, then do me a favor. Hit that subscribe button and ring the bell so you never miss a story that will stay with you long after it ends. Now, let's step into the freezing sleet of a Tuesday morning where a barista is about to make the most dangerous decision of her life. The screeching, furious hiss of the espresso machine sounded exactly like a boiling kettle of stress, masking the panicked thudding of Abby Burns' heart. She stood behind the worn oak counter of the gilded kettle, staring blankly at the crumpled piece of paper beside the cash register. The red ink of the 30-day foreclosure notice seemed to bleed into the wood. 30 days. That was all the bank was giving her before they seized her late father's legacy. "Excuse me, miss? Are we grinding the beans by hand today or what?"
Oh, I'm sorry.
Abby blinked, the harsh reality of the cafe rushing back. A line of 4 impatient, Bluetooth-wearing finance executives stood glaring at her, checking their expensive smartwatches with synchronized irritation. The tension in the small shop was suffocating, thick with the smell of roasted coffee and corporate entitlement. Abby wiped her flour-dusted hands on her vintage, blue-patterned apron and adjusted the matching headband holding back her hair. She needed these customers. She needed every single pound and penny they were willing to spend. Her younger sister Lily's medical bills were piled high on the kitchen table upstairs, a mountain of debt that threatened to crush them both. Reason dictated that she apologize, smile the way she was supposed to, and ring up their overpriced lattes. Instead, Abby did the unthinkable. She ignored the angry suits entirely. Turning her back to the line, she reached for the top shelf and pulled down a small, sealed tin. It was the reserve Darjeeling, the rarest, most expensive inventory she had left. It was tea meant to be sold at a premium, the kind of luxury that could pay for Lily's medications for a week. Abby popped the seal. She measured the leaves with steady, deliberate hands, the fragrant, earthy aroma filling the space. She steeped it to perfection, poured the amber liquid into a delicate, gold-trimmed floral teacup, and placed it on a silver serving tray. "Hey, where do you think you're going?" one of the executives barked as Abby bypassed the counter, pushed the heavy glass door open, and walked straight out into the freezing London sleet. The icy wind bit immediately at her exposed skin, but Abby kept her eyes focused across the cobblestone street. There, huddled against the majestic, imposing wrought-iron gates of a nearby estate, sat Birdie. The old woman was a fixture of the street, though most chose to look right through her. She was deeply weathered, her spine curved beneath a filthy patchwork shawl and a tattered brown bonnet that barely shielded her from the biting cold. In her frail, dirt-streaked hands, she clutched a thick, tattered leather book against her chest, as if it were a shield against the world. "Morning, Birdie," Abby murmured, her voice dropping into a gentle, soothing cadence as she knelt on the icy pavement. The old woman flinched, skittish as a stray cat, her wide, haunted eyes darting around the street. She was entirely mute, having never spoken a single word in the months Abby had known her. "It's all right. It's just me," Abby smiled warmly, offering the silver tray. "I brought the good stuff today. Darjeeling. It'll warm you right up to your toes." Birdie's trembling, calloused fingers reached out, bypassing the tray to cradle the warm china cup. She didn't say thank you, but her shoulders dropped a fraction of an inch. Abby stayed kneeling in the freezing slush, offering a one-sided stream of comforting chatter about the weather and her café, providing the only scrap of dignity the old woman would receive that day. Abby was risking her livelihood for a stranger who could offer her absolutely nothing in return, simply because she couldn't bear to let her freeze. Then, the underlying hum of the city shifted. The street fell dead, unnervingly silent. The aggressive rumble of heavy engines swallowed the quiet. A motorcade of 3 sleek black SUVs rounded the corner, flanking a pristine, vintage black Bentley. The vehicle swerved and braked abruptly, blocking the entire cobblestone street in front of the cafe. Abby froze, still kneeling by Birdie. The heavy door of the Bentley swung open. Out stepped a man who looked like he owned the very ground he walked on. He was impeccably dressed in a sharp, tailored grey overcoat and a dark cravat, radiating a fierce, imposing authority. It was Alexander Austin, the billionaire Duke of Kensington. Suddenly, the flashing bulbs of trailing paparazzi began to pop from down the street, shouting his name. The Duke ignored them completely. His dark eyes locked instantly onto the ragged vagrant holding the floral teacup. The power dynamic of the entire street vanished in a heartbeat. The billionaire didn't order his guards to clear the vagrant away. He didn't even check his surroundings. Instead, Alexander Austin walked forward and dropped to his knees in the dirty, freezing slush, ruining his bespoke suit as he stared at the old woman. His voice broke, breathless and thick with disbelief. "Grandmother." At the word, Birdie panicked. The teacup rattled against its saucer. She scrambled backward against the iron gates, clutching her leather book tighter to her chest, and reached out, wrapping her trembling fingers into the fabric of Abby's flour-dusted apron. She hid behind the barista, terrified. Alexander's commanding composure shattered. He looked up, his eyes meeting Abby's. The imposing, untouchable Duke of Kensington was suddenly nothing more than a desperate, terrified man. He stared at the bewildered cafe owner and whispered, "Please, she won't come without you. Get in the car." "Please," Alexander repeated, the single syllable entirely devoid of a billionaire's entitlement. "She won't come without you. Get in the car." Abby looked over her shoulder at the fogged windows of the gilded Kettle, where the finance executives were undoubtedly still tapping their watches, preparing to ruin her online rating. Then she looked down at the trembling woman clinging to her flour-dusted apron. The choice was entirely irrational, violating every rule of self-preservation she had left. Abby stepped into the Bentley. The transition was jarring, a violent sensory shift from the biting London sleet into a world of hermetically sealed, climate-controlled luxury. The heavy door clicked shut with a solid thud, instantly severing them from the popping flashes and muffled shouts of the paparazzi. As the motorcade surged forward, the Dowager Duchess of Kensington, Abby corrected herself dizzily, refused to let go of Abby's hand, her thin fingers cold as ice. Within 20 minutes, the vehicles bypassed the city's gridlock and descended into the subterranean, hyper-secure garage of a towering glass and steel skyscraper. Private elevators shot them upward with stomach-dropping speed, the doors sliding open directly into the Austin family's penthouse. Abby stepped out and immediately felt the crushing weight of the class divide. The penthouse was a sprawling monument to modern wealth, floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the Thames, minimalist monochromatic furniture, and acres of pristine white marble that gleamed like a frozen lake. Standing there in her scuffed work boots and stained vintage apron, Abby felt like a smudge of dirt on a priceless museum exhibit. A team of uniformed staff and private medical personnel rushed forward the moment the elevator chimed. But Beatrice recoiled, emitting a sharp, panicked whimper. She pressed herself behind Abby's back, her gnarled hands gripping the barista's apron strings like a lifeline. "Stop! Stand down, all of you!" Alexander commanded. The staff froze instantly. He ran a hand through his immaculately styled hair, ruining it, and let out a ragged, exhausted breath. "Everyone out! Clear the floor! Now!" Once the vast, echoing living space was empty, the heavy silence returned. Alexander moved toward a crystal decanter on a floating glass console. For the first time, Abby noticed that his hands were shaking violently. He poured a neat measure of amber liquid, downed it in a single swallow, and leaned heavily against the console. In the quiet of the room, The impenetrable armor of the imposing Duke was completely stripped away. "We thought she was gone," Alexander murmured, his voice hollow. He wasn't speaking to the empty room, he was speaking to Abby. 6 months ago, her mind just broke. The doctors diagnosed her with rapid onset severe dementia. She didn't know her own name. Then, one morning, she vanished from the country estate. We dredged the lakes, we scoured the woods. I have spent millions on private intelligence firms trying to find a single trace of her. He looked up, his dark eyes shimmering with unshed tears, fixing on the fragile, dirty woman still hiding behind Abby. They told me she had wandered off to die in the cold. I had started planning the memorial. Looking at him, Abby didn't see a cold corporate oligarch or a titled aristocrat. She saw a terrified, grieving grandson who had just been handed a miracle he didn't know how to handle. "She needs a bath," Abby said softly, grounding them both in immediate reality. "She's freezing, and she won't let your people touch her. Show me where the bathroom is." Alexander nodded numbly, leading them down a wide corridor to a master suite. The ensuite bathroom was a cavern of heated floors, gold fixtures, and frosted glass. Abby closed the heavy door, shutting out the billionaire and his staggering world, returning to the simple, human act of care. "It's just us, Birdie," Abby cooed, turning on the brass taps to fill the massive, sunken tub with warm water and lavender salts. "Let's get you warm." Coaxing the old woman out of her filthy layers took agonizing patience. The patchwork shawl was practically fused to her thin frame. Yet, even as Abby gently peeled away the grimy fabric, Beatrice maintained a white-knuckled death grip on her tattered leather book. It was her anchor, her shield against the terrors of the outside world. "You can't take it in the water," Abby whispered, offering a plush, heated towel. "I promise I won't let anyone touch it. Just put it right here." Beatrice hesitated. Her haunted eyes searched Abby's face for a long, heavy moment, looking for a trap. Finally, her trembling fingers loosened. She placed the book on the edge of the slick marble vanity. But her hands were too weak, and the marble was too smooth. The heavy leather book slid off the edge and hit the floor with a sharp smack, its worn spine giving way and bursting open upon impact. "I've got it," Abby said quickly, dropping to her knees to gather the scattered, yellowed pages. She expected to see the confused scribbles of a broken mind, or perhaps a diary filled with faded, tragic memories. Instead, Abby's hands froze. The pages were not the ramblings of a madwoman, they were filled with crisp, meticulously recorded data. There were complex financial routing codes, lists of offshore shell companies in the Cayman Islands, and highlighted wire transfers in the tens of millions. But it was a folded insert near the back cover that made Abby's blood run entirely cold. Tucked inside were printed laboratory reports, detailed blood toxicology notes documenting the systematic daily administration of heavy, mind-altering sedatives. Abby stared at the paper, her breath catching in her throat as the horrifying truth settled over her. This wasn't a diary. It was an evidence ledger. And someone in the Austin family had been methodically poisoning the Dowager Duchess. Abby's hands shook so violently she nearly tore the fragile, yellowed pages. She scrambled backward on the heated marble, her mind struggling to process the clinical, damning terminology printed on the laboratory letterhead. Lorazepam, haloperidol, scopolamine. These weren't medications for a failing memory. They were a chemical cocktail designed to systematically dismantle a human mind. She looked up at Beatrice, who was watching her with an expression of profound, silent urgency. The Dowager hadn't lost her mind. It had been stolen from her. Hours later, the penthouse study was a cavern of shadows and sharp, modern angles, illuminated only by the harsh glow of a single desk lamp. The rain lashed against the floor-to-ceiling windows, mirroring the violent storm breaking inside the room. Alexander stood over the massive glass desk, both hands planted on the surface, as he stared at the scattered pages of the ledger. He looked physically ill. The bespoke armor of the billionaire Duke was completely gone, replaced by a man suffocating on the fumes of a staggering betrayal. "Reginald," Alexander choked out, the name tasting like ash in his mouth. He traced a trembling finger over a sequence of highlighted wire transfers. "My father's own brother. He sat at our dining table. He cried at the funeral when we thought she was dead." Abby stood on the opposite side of the desk, still wearing her flour-dusted clothes, though they felt entirely irrelevant now. "Look at the dates, Alexander." She pointed to the margins of the toxicology report. He wasn't just sedating her. He was microdosing her to perfectly mimic the symptoms of rapid-onset dementia. He was building a medical history to have her declared legally incompetent. "To seize the Austin Philanthropic Trust," Alexander finished, his voice dropping into a hollow, dangerous register. "It's a multi-billion-dollar endowment. Grandmother controls the voting shares. If she's dead or permanently incapacitated, control defaults to Reginald. He wanted to liquidate the charity shell companies to fund his corrupt real estate ventures." The click of a door latch severed the heavy silence. Abby and Alexander both turned. Standing in the doorway of the study was Beatrice. She was no longer a grime-covered vagrant. Bathed, her silver hair brushed and pinned back, she was swallowed by one of Alexander's plush, oversized cashmere sweaters, yet she stood with a quiet, undeniable dignity. Abby instinctively moved toward the kitchenette tucked into the corner of the study. She had brewed a fresh pot of Darjeeling an hour ago to keep herself awake. She poured a steaming cup and brought it to the dowager, guiding her to a leather armchair. Beatrice took the delicate porcelain between her clean, pale hands. She brought it to her lips, took a slow sip, and closed her eyes. "It requires a minute more of steeping." The voice was rusty, gravelly from months of absolute disuse, but it cut through the room with the sharp, unmistakable authority of a duchess. Alexander froze. The blood drained from his face. He dropped to his knees beside her chair, burying his face in the folds of her borrowed sweater. "Grandmother," he sobbed, the sound completely unmoored. Beatrice rested a trembling hand on his dark hair, her own eyes shining with tears. "My brave boy, I am so sorry I had to leave you." Alexander looked up, wiping his face, his expression a fractured mix of relief and desperate confusion. "Why the streets? Why didn't you come to me? And why hide outside a bankrupt coffee shop?" Beatrice looked over Alexander's shoulder, her piercing gaze locking onto Abby. "Because 60 years ago, on those exact cobblestones, your grandfather asked me to marry him. It was the only place in London my fractured mind could hold on to." She paused, her grip tightening on the teacup. "But that is not why I stayed. I stayed because of Thomas." Abby's breath hitched. "My father?" "Yes, Abigail," Beatrice said softly, speaking her name like a blessing. 6 months ago, Reginald dragged me to the Gilded Kettle for a public relations photo op to show society how dutifully he cared for his ailing mother. I was heavily drugged, terrified, trapped inside my own failing body. But your father, Thomas saw it. Tears spilled hot and fast down Abby's cheeks. Her father had died drowning in debt, convinced he had failed his daughters. Your father was the only person in this sprawling, blind city who looked at me, not past me, Beatrice continued, her voice gaining strength. He noticed the pinpoint pupils, the tremors. When Reginald stepped outside to take a call, Thomas slipped a pen and a napkin into my hand. I wrote one word: poison. Abby covered her mouth, a sob escaping her throat. Your father risked everything, Beatrice said. He helped me secure those blood samples. He helped me smuggle the original, uncompromised evidence and my sworn affidavits to my solicitors in Zurich just before his heart gave out. When he died, I knew Reginald would accelerate the dosage to kill me. So, I faked my disappearance. I hid in the one place Reginald would never look, the gutter. I sat outside Thomas's café, waiting for the Zurich lawyers to act, guarding the ledger that mapped the truth. The magnitude of the revelation hung in the air, binding the billionaire and the barista in a shared legacy of sacrifice. Abby's father hadn't failed. He had died a hero, fighting a shadow war for a woman he barely knew. Suddenly, the harsh, electronic buzzing of Alexander's encrypted phone shattered the moment. Alexander snatched it from the desk. As he read the message from a loyal contact inside his corporate headquarters, his jaw clenched so tightly the muscle ticked. "The Zurich lawyers must have finally contacted the board," Alexander said, his voice laced with cold dread. "Reginald knows the walls are closing in." "What is it?" Abby asked, her pulse hammering against her ribs. Alexander looked up, his dark eyes ablaze with a terrifying urgency. "Reginald has bypassed the standard protocols. He's convened an emergency hostile board meeting for 8 o'clock tomorrow morning. He's pushing through an emergency motion to legally dissolve the trust and sign the assets over to his holding companies before the Zurich documents can be verified." Abby looked at the clock on the wall. It was 3 a.m. Abby's cafe wasn't just a coffee shop. It was the anchor to the Austin family's salvation, a monument to a humble man's bravery. But that bravery was about to be erased. They had exactly 5 hours to infiltrate a boardroom of the most powerful elites in London and stop a multi-billion-dollar coup, or Reginald would win everything. The 60th floor of the Austin Global headquarters was a fortress of glass, steel, and suffocating wealth. Rain pounded against the panoramic windows, but inside the soundproofed executive boardroom, the only noise was the synchronized, shallow breathing of London's most ruthless financial elites. At the head of the 40-foot mahogany table sat Lord Reginald Austin. His tailored charcoal suit exuded the smug, practiced arrogance of a man who believed he had already won. Before him lay a thick stack of vellum legal documents and a heavy gold fountain pen. "It is a tragedy, of course," Reginald murmured, pressing a handkerchief to his dry eyes with theatrical grief. "My dear mother's mind failed her, and the harsh elements took her from us. But the Austin Philanthropic Trust cannot be left to stagnate. By signing this decree of presumed death, we dissolve the archaic charity structures and merge the multi-billion-dollar endowment with my holding companies, for the good of the family legacy, naturally." He uncapped the gold pen. The nib hovered millimeters above the signature line. The heavy oak doors of the boardroom violently burst open, slamming against the paneled walls with a noise like a gunshot. Alexander strode into the room, his dark eyes ablaze with a fury so potent it made the temperature in the room plummet. He had shed his overcoat, his jaw clenched, looking less like a modern billionaire and more like an avenging king. "Put the pen down, Reginald," Alexander commanded, his voice a low, lethal thunderclap. Reginald didn't flinch. He offered a condescending, pitying smile to the board members. "Alexander, please. I know the grief is tearing you apart. You're erratic. You've been chasing ghosts for 6 months. I said drop the pen. You are committing multi-billion-dollar fraud." "Security," Reginald sighed, waving a dismissive hand. "Escort my nephew to medical. He's having a breakdown. The law is clear, Alexander. The 48-hour emergency provision allows this board to act. You have no physical proof of her survival, only wild rumors from Zurich lawyers who haven't produced a shred of authenticated evidence. My mother is dead." "Are you quite certain of that, Reginald?" The voice did not come from Alexander. It came from the doorway, sharp as cut glass and echoing with the terrifying, absolute authority of 60 years of aristocratic rule. Every head in the boardroom snapped toward the entrance. Several of the older board members audibly gasped. 2 of them stood up so quickly their heavy leather chairs tipped backward. Standing in the threshold was Dowager Duchess Beatrice. She was no longer Birdie, the vagrant. The filthy patchwork shawl and tattered bonnet were gone. In their place, she wore a pristine, impeccably tailored navy blue Chanel suit that Alexander's staff had rushed in at dawn. Her silver hair was elegantly swept back, and her spine was entirely straight. She did not look like a victim. She looked like an executioner. Beside her, providing the physical anchor she needed to stand so tall, was Abby. The barista still wore her simple denim jacket and scuffed work boots, her presence a glaring, beautiful anomaly in the sea of bespoke corporate suits. Reginald's face drained of all color. The gold fountain pen slipped from his trembling fingers, clattering loudly against the mahogany table. "Mother, how?" "You always were a terrible liar, Reginald," Beatrice said, her voice dropping the temperature in the room by 10 degrees. With slow, deliberate steps, leaning gently on Abby's arm, she walked toward the head of the table. Alexander stepped aside, allowing his grandmother the floor. Beatrice reached the table and pulled her arm free from Abby. With a sharp flick of her wrist, she slammed the tattered leather ledger directly onto the legal documents Reginald had been about to sign. "I am not a ghost, nor am I a fool," Beatrice stated, her piercing gaze pinning her son to his chair. "In this ledger is the meticulously documented proof of your treachery. The offshore accounts, the forged medical directives, and the toxicology reports detailing the heavy sedatives you systematically poisoned me with to steal my mind." Reginald scrambled backward, his chair squeaking against the floor. "This is absurd. She's insane. She's been wandering the streets. That girl with her is a grifter." "That girl," Beatrice interrupted, her voice ringing like a bell, "is the daughter of the only man with the courage to see what you were doing to me. And she is under my absolute protection." Alexander snapped his fingers. From the hallway, 3 plainclothes inspectors from Scotland Yard stepped into the boardroom, flashing their badges. "Lord Reginald Austin," the lead inspector said, producing a pair of steel handcuffs. "You are under arrest for conspiracy to commit murder, fraud, and embezzlement. The Zurich documents arrived an hour ago, fully authenticated." Reginald sputtered, his arrogant facade completely shattering as the officers hauled him out of his chair and dragged him toward the exit. The board members erupted into a frenzy of panicked whispers and frantic phone calls, desperately trying to distance themselves from the ousted traitor. Alexander rushed forward, wrapping his arms around his grandmother as she finally let out a shaky breath, the immense adrenaline beginning to fade. The empire was safe. The nightmare was over. But as the boardroom swirled with chaos, apologies, and the flashing lights of police cruisers far below, Abby stepped backward. She looked at the gleaming mahogany, the weeping billionaires, and the royal embrace. This was a world of titans, and she was just a barista drowning in debt. Her father's legacy was honored, her duty was fulfilled, and her role in this grand play was officially over. Before Alexander or Beatrice could turn around to thank her, Abby slipped quietly out the heavy oak doors, disappearing into the cold glass elevator. 3 days had passed since the glass and steel fortress of the Austin Empire had been turned upside down. For Abby Byrne, however, the world had simply reverted to its brutal, unforgiving orbit. The gilded kettle was devastatingly quiet. The comforting hiss of the espresso machine had been silenced, replaced by the hollow, depressing scrape of packing tape echoing off the walls. Abby stood in the center of the room, wearing her faded blue apron, carefully wrapping her late father's porcelain teacups in old newspaper. The red stamped foreclosure notice on the counter was no longer a 30-day warning. Time was up. Lily's medical bills were still piled on the upstairs table, a mountain Abby could no longer climb. She had helped save a dynasty, but her own legacy was ending in cardboard boxes. The silver bell above the door chimed, making her jump. Abby turned, expecting the bank manager. Instead, a courier in a crisp uniform stood on the welcome mat, holding a heavy, leather-bound legal dossier. "Abigail Byrne?" he asked, extending the package. "Sign here, please." Abby's hands trembled as she took the heavy folder. She fully expected a non-disclosure agreement, or perhaps a polite, sterile thank you check from the Duke's legal team to quietly dismiss her back into obscurity. But as she broke the embossed wax seal and opened the first page, the breath left her lungs. This wasn't a payout. It was a formal declaration from the Austin Philanthropic Trust. Dowager Duchess Beatrice had not handed her charity. She had orchestrated a masterstroke of business. The documents officially designated the Gilded Kettle as a protected historical heritage site, the exact landmark where the previous Duke had proposed, and the sanctuary where a humble cafe owner named Thomas had risked his life to expose a royal conspiracy. Attached was a partnership contract. The trust was purchasing a silent, minority stake in the cafe at a valuation so staggering it made Abby dizzy. It instantly wiped out the bank debt, fully funded Lily's medical trust, and guaranteed the shop's future for the next century. It wasn't a rescue from a billionaire. It was an investment. Her father's courage and her own relentless empathy had earned every single penny of it. Before Abby could wipe the tears blurring her vision, the ambient noise of the street outside shifted into a chaotic roar. The aggressive purr of a massive engine vibrated through the floorboards. Abby looked through the front window. The pristine vintage black Bentley had returned, parking illegally right on the cobblestones. Instantly, a swarm of paparazzi descended, their camera flashes strobing like lightning against the overcast London sky. The press was hungry. Following Reginald's spectacular arrest, they expected the young Duke to announce a massive corporate restructuring, or perhaps a strategic, high-society engagement to stabilize the family's stock. But Alexander Austin didn't step out with a team of corporate lawyers or a royal heiress. He stepped out alone. No bodyguards, no PR team. He pushed through the heavy glass door of the Gilded Kettle, the little silver bell chiming cheerfully as he entered. He was dressed simply, a dark, tailored sweater and slacks, but the sheer gravity of his presence made the small room feel electric. The cameras pressed against the glass outside, capturing his every move. Alexander didn't look at the flashing bulbs. He looked only at Abby. He walked straight through the maze of cardboard boxes, his expensive shoes leaving faint tracks in the flour dust that coated the floorboards. When he reached the counter, he didn't offer her a check or a royal decree. He simply reached out and took her flour-dusted hand in his. "The world thinks I came here to secure an asset," Alexander said, his voice carrying a quiet, unwavering strength that penetrated the glass and reached the microphones outside. "But they don't understand that true wealth isn't measured in offshore accounts or royal titles. It's measured in the courage to protect those who cannot protect themselves. It's measured by the woman standing in front of me." The cameras went absolutely wild. Alexander's intense gaze softened into something profoundly vulnerable, meant only for her. "The boardroom is secure, grandmother is safe, and she is demanding you come for tea. But before that..." He squeezed her hand, a tentative, hopeful smile breaking across his face. "Are you free for dinner tonight, Abby?" Abby looked at the man who had laid his empire at her feet, then at the cafe her father built, now safe forever. A brilliant, tearful smile broke across her face. "I'll need to change out of my apron." "Don't," Alexander whispered back. "It's perfect." The truth of this world is that true nobility has never been defined by the blood in your veins or the balance in your bank account. It is defined by how you treat a stranger when you think the world isn't watching. In the end, a sprawling billion-dollar empire wasn't saved by an army of lawyers or a vault of gold. It was saved by a barista who decided that a single cup of tea, poured in pure, unselfish kindness, was worth risking everything. I'm always amazed by how a simple act of humanity can ripple across the globe. Speaking of the globe, I'm genuinely curious to know where you're listening from today. Drop your city or country down in the comments. And if you want to keep exploring stories that remind us of the good in people, make sure to subscribe, tap the bell, and share this video with someone who needs a reminder that kindness still wins. See you in the next one.